Hey Wisecrack, Jared here. Today we're talking about two of the most meta games since Psycho Mantis read our memory files, the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide, both written and designed by Davey Wreden. Back in 2010, film critic Roger Ebert infamously claimed that video games can never be art, to which Wreden essentially said, "Hold my beer." These games belong to a genre that's been derided as walking simulators, since that's basically all you can mechanically do as the player. But where Wreden's games lack in loot and experience points, they more than make up for in artistic ambition, specifically in how they use the unique aspects of video games as a medium in order to smartly comment on everything surrounding that medium. They explore the canvas on which games are painted by talking about engines like Source.
To make all of these games, Coda is using an engine called Source.
They talk about the commercial aspects of games through subtle jabs at Steam. They deconstruct the usually unquestioned conventions of genres such as first-person shooters, but mostly they examine the role of the artists making this art, the programmers, and the audience appreciating it, the players, and the relationship between the two. Welcome to this Wisecrack edition on the works of Davey Wreden, and as always, spoilers ahead. Let's start with Wreden's first game, The Stanley Parable. It's a walking simulator that can be beat in about 5 minutes by simply following the directions of the game's narrator.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
Just take the door on the left, follow all the other instructions, and before you know it, you've beat the game. Except, not really, because you can always replay it and see what was past the door on the right, or any of the other branching forks. Game designer Sid Meier famously defined games as a series of interesting decisions, and the Stanley Parable is exactly that. Despite the mundane office environment, decisions like whether to follow the path forward or take the exit marked escape are genuinely interesting, because they all lead to a wide array of alternate endings, many of which break the fourth wall or deconstruct the medium. That's probably why it's often been described as a game about games, but it would probably be more accurate to describe the Stanley Parable as a game about gamers, or rather a parable about gamers. For those of you that skipped Sunday school, a parable is a short allegorical story designed to illustrate or teach some truth, religious principle, or moral lesson. Stanley, aka employee number 427, is an overt allegory for the player, and there are a lot of hard truths to swallow for us gamers. Right from the start, the narrator explains,
Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard. Orders came to him through a monitor on his desk, telling him what buttons to push, how long to push them, and in what order. This is what employee 427 did every day of every month of every year. And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job. And Stanley was happy.
The parallels here are really on the nose. While hearing that Stanley was sitting at his desk staring at his computer, the player is doing the exact same thing. The orders that come through the monitor represent computer games that require no critical engagement from the player. At their most crude, games literally tell the player press F to pay respects, but even games that forgo QuickTime events often boil down to press the right button at the right time. A lot of us here at Wisecrack are loving The Division 2, but a lot of that game is just following the yellow quest line to the next mission and then doing exactly what the voice over the radio tells you to.
That should get there, Usually. Head to the service entrance on the east side of the building.
He doesn't even need to ask,
Would you kindly?
But the most damning criticism comes at the end of the narrator's description. Stanley was happy, as if this was exactly what he was made to do, just follow orders mindlessly. The problem isn't merely that games don't demand critical engagement from the player, it's that players don't demand critically engaging games. There's a famous quote by philosopher John Stuart Mill: "Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Wreden probably isn't just trying to ruin anyone's blissful ignorance just to be a dick. From the games he's made, it's pretty clear that he thinks that gaming can be much more than dumb diversions designed to kill time. The game further emphasizes the identification of Stanley with the player by having the narrator address both interchangeably.
No, wait, where are you going?
In the main path, called the Freedom ending, the narrator always retains a third-person omniscient perspective.
He had won. He had defeated the machine.
Even here, by virtue of the player's first-person perspective as Stanley, there's more identification with Stanley than in passive media like film or television. Even though the narrator is explaining that Stanley took the door on the left, the player is thinking, I'll take the door on the left. But in other paths, the distinction between Stanley and the player begins to break down even more. In the Insanity ending, the narrator puts a thought inside the player's head by describing Stanley as thinking it.
And then perhaps the strangest question of them all entered Stanley's head. One he was amazed he hadn't asked himself sooner. Why is there a voice in my head dictating everything that I'm doing and thinking? Now the voice was describing itself being considered by Stanley, who found it particularly strange.
In some paths, the narrator even breaks the fourth wall to address the player directly, as when the player stays in the broom closet too long and the narrator calls out through the monitor for the body to be cleared away, assuming the player has died at his keyboard.
You got to this broom closet, explored it a bit, and were just about to leave because there's nothing here, when a physical malady of some sort shut down your central nervous system and you collapsed on the keyboard.
As evidenced by all this pre-canned dialogue for the narrator, Stanley as a character, and therefore the player as well, is never given any meaningful choices that the game doesn't account for. As soon as a player thinks he's found a hidden corner of the map or a way to break the game, the narrator immediately comments upon it, revealing that this choice too was already accounted for. This is lampshaded in the real person ending, in which the narrator concludes the player must be a real person and not Stanley by virtue of the fact that he makes a choice purportedly not accounted for in the script.
You're not Stanley. You're a real person. I can't believe I was so mistaken. This is why you've been able to make correct and incorrect choices.
The same is true with the Out of Bounds ending.
At first, Stanley assumed he'd broken the map, until he heard this narration and realized it was part of the game's design all along. He then praised the game for its insightful and witty commentary into the nature of video game structure and its examination of structural narrative tropes.
Here the game is pretty open about the fact that it's a commentary on the medium. As a game about games, it's easy to read the Stanley Parable as exploring the illusion of choice in games. After all, that's clearly what it means by these structural narrative tropes. But in reading Stanley as the player, the game does offer a seemingly genuine choice between playing the game and not playing the game. In the museum ending, a female narrator tells the player,
"Push escape and press quit. There's no other way to beat this game. As long as you move forward, you'll be walking someone else's path. Stop now and it'll be your only true choice."
This is not an arbitrary choice as between the doors on the left and right. The game seems to imply that the player is wasting his life by sitting at a computer screen and following the orders it prescribes in order to advance, and that the better choice would be to turn the game off and walk away. This is spelled out explicitly in the wife ending.
In reality, all he's doing is pushing the same buttons he always has. Nothing has changed. The longer he spends here, the more invested he gets, the more he forgets which life is the real one. And I'm trying to tell him this, that in this world he can never be anything but an observer, that as long as he remains here, he's slowly killing himself.
But is the game really implying that all games, including itself, are a waste of the player's time? Or is it being ironic? After all, the game indulges in irony in other parts. The so-called freedom ending is only achievable by complete obedience to all the instructions barked at the player. So is the game's own disregard for itself just further facetiousness? Well, there's definitely evidence to suggest that the game is being straightforward in its implication that gaming really is an exercise in futility. Some of the achievements in particular require zero challenge whatsoever, highlighting that they're not really achievements in the literal sense. There's one called "This is an Achievement," which is awarded just for enabling achievements in the options. Then there's the Go Outside achievement, which requires the player to not play the game for 5 years. The title even suggests that going outside would be a better use of the player's time. The game even raises the question as to whether or not it has anything meaningful to say. The art ending, which requires pushing a button every few seconds for several hours, rewards the player's efforts with the intentionally disappointing Essence of Divine Art, a solid black monolith spouting pretentious gibberish, a clear comment on the tedium gamers will endure to earn a reward that wasn't worth pursuing in the first place. And yet, the irony is that this commentary on tedium isn't in itself insightful enough to make it worth one's time. Alternatively, the game at points thinks it does have something insightful to say, as in the broom closet ending.
And instruct another human to take their place at the computer, making sure they understand basic first-person video game mechanics and filling them in on the history of narrative tropes in video gaming. so that the irony and insightful commentary of this game is not lost on them.
So what's the ironic, insightful commentary of the Stanley Parable? Well, we think it's this, that a game which purports to waste the player's time and undermine the importance of games as a medium is actually an example of the artistic merits unique to that medium, particularly in its use of the first-person perspective to create an identification with the character. By calling the player out on passively engaging with non-demanding games and asking him to engage more critically with the medium going forward, the game becomes a valuable use of the player's time. It's a wake-up call to be a better gamer, not by getting higher scores or better kill-to-death ratios, but by being less a fool satisfied and more like Socrates dissatisfied. But if the Stanley Parable merely encourages critical appreciation of games through its narrative, the Beginner's Guide makes criticism the actual gameplay mechanic. Whereas the Stanley Parable had bare-bones gameplay that really only allowed the player to decide between a series of binary choices, the Beginner's Guide strips back gameplay even more. It's a series of short standalone games, some only a few seconds long. They're presented to the player in a particular order, so you don't even have the choice of which game to play. They're really more like linear levels, and within those levels, there might be a single simple puzzle, or a gun but no enemies to shoot, or dialogue choices that don't matter, but mostly the only thing to do is just keep moving forward. But it's by making a game with no obvious gameplay that Reedon is able to make criticism the main mechanic that the player learns. The conceit of this game is that each of these levels were designed by a designer nicknamed Coda, and a fictitious version of Reedon offers his own observations and criticisms as you're walking through them.
It is less advanced than the previous game, but actually it seems to be more focused, more complete. Coda's trying to give it a unique voice rather than simply basing it on a pre-existing trope.
By the end, the player realizes that Coda is fictional. There are a lot of theories as to what he's supposed to represent, mostly some aspect of Reedon, such as his past self, part of his psyche, his creative genius, or how his fans see him. So other than walking forward, what Reedon really wants the player to do is to critically consider Coda's design choices and to internally dialogue with Reedon on his interpretation. That's why the game is called the Beginner's Guide. It's your introductory walkthrough on how to do games criticism. At the end of the first level, Reedon gives his email address and encourages players to write in with their own interpretation, especially if they differ from his.
If you have a particular interpretation that I haven't mentioned here, or if you just need to get in touch, you can email me at daveyWreden@gmail.com.
This sets the expectation for the player that their primary engagement with each level will be analysis as a critic rather than traditional gameplay. But it also highlights that the interpretation put forth in Reedon's narration shouldn't be taken as gospel truth. The real meaning might not be laid out so easily. That's important because the main motif explored across all levels within the Beginner's Guide is authorial intent, or the belief that whatever the author meant for the work to say is what it really means. Reedon is taking that framework and applying it to games criticism, asking us to ask the same questions about Coda and his games. Because Reedon claims to be a friend of Coda's with knowledge of him as a person and not merely as a designer, he initially suggests that this gives him additional insight into the design. When you're first playing the game and still under the assumption that Coda is a real individual, the biographical insights which Reedon shares really do seem to make sense out of the game design. One game entitled Islands begins on a series of isolated islands afloat in an empty white void. While this could certainly be suggestive of solitude, Reedon forces the interpretation of Coda's loneliness onto the player by explaining his friend's emotional state during the development of the game.
Now, put yourself in my shoes playing this. Here's a friend whose work is exhibiting signs of struggle, frustration, anxiety, depression. From my perspective at the time and just what I knew of him, this was a result of how isolated he was. He was in his own little bubble, just sitting at his computer all day, not really showing these games to anyone, not releasing them onto the internet, and so he didn't have anyone outside of himself to connect with. He had no outlet to ground himself on.
It's a reading of the level that the player might not have given as much weight to had they not been told this background information. But the game also explores the idea of authorial intent by repeatedly claiming to diverge from what the original designer had intended. Time and again throughout the games, Reedon tells the player that he's going to modify the level in some way.
Once you've been slowed to an absolute crawl, the door at the top of the stairs opens. So why, if Coda's not showing these games to anyone, why bother opening the door at all? Well, to show you, I'm modifying the game here so that when you press the use key on your gamepad, it'll bring you back up to full speed so you can enter the door for yourself.
Either in order to show something that would otherwise remain hidden, or to simply make the game playable. In the game Down, Reedon claims that Coda originally intended for the player to be locked in a prison cell for a full hour. In the game Puzzle, Reedon removes the walls of the cramped corridor to reveal an unseen exterior that is hundreds of times bigger than the playable area. By explicitly breaking from Coda's creative vision, the player is prompted to give more consideration as to what Coda would have been trying to communicate through those design decisions. But this doesn't just force players to consider the creator's intent, it also forces them to consider the creator's design philosophy. Whereas Reedon claims to be modifying all these games because he believes that all games should be playable and understandable, the exact opposite belief is attributed to Coda.
This is something that he and I used to argue about a lot. You know, whether a game ought to actually be playable, whether it means anything if no one can get through it. And I would always defend that, you know, all this work goes into the game, why not make it playable and accessible? And so we just got into heated arguments over it, and there was one time that after one of these conversations, he went home, and a day or two later, he sent me a zip file entitled Playable Games that was full of hundreds of individual games, each of which was just an empty box that you walked around in and nothing else.
If the player has been learning how to critically engage with the game, then by the final level when it becomes evident that Reedon is an unreliable narrator, the player will likewise realize that there is no Coda. So if the player dismisses Coda and just interprets these microgames as a creation of Reedon's, he might feel like he's gotten some insight into who Reedon is as an individual, and as such, might be tempted to understand Reedon's authorial intent behind these design decisions. This is especially tempting if the player really does have some first-hand account from the real Reedon, such as his blog post written during the development of the Beginner's Guide, where he lays out exactly what he was feeling after the release of the Stanley Parable. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't talk to more people. I couldn't continue to use other people's opinions of myself to feel good about myself and about my work. Every time I turned to someone else's opinion of the game, I felt less sure of my own opinion of it. I began to forget why I liked the game. I was losing the thing I had created. But just as the player is perhaps considering this, the text of the game challenges this theory underlying authorial intent. The final game, Tower, expressly rejects the notion that biographic knowledge leads to insight. In it, Coda leaves messages to Reedon stating, "Struggling to come up with new ideas is not making me depressed. The fact you think I'm frustrated or broken says more about you than about me." The point of this reversal isn't for the player to go back and replay the game with knowledge that Reedon made the game and that he himself was the one that was frustrated or broken. But it's also not that the player needs to ignore those details and just focus on understanding the game in a vacuum. The competing views of authorial intentionalism, which treats biographic data and the author's intent as relevant, and death of the author, which does not, are two of the basic frameworks for critical interpretation in any medium. The real Reedon that made the game doesn't seem to be prescribing one or the other, so much as he's forcing players to consider both perspectives as part of their burgeoning careers as game critics. By leaving fundamental questions about the Beginner's Guide open, such as the reliability of Reedon as a narrator or the true identity of Coda, the game forces the players to engage it more critically than if Reedon had simply walked the player through the levels and spoon-fed them information about the design, the production, or his own creative process. The game never questions, as Stanley Parable had, whether playing the Beginner's Guide and searching for these answers is a worthwhile use of the player's time. It tacitly assumes that the act of critical engagement while playing it is worthwhile. Near the beginning of the Beginner's Guide, Reedon states,
"There's a bigger picture that all of his games are meant to play a role in, some larger meaning that we won't be able to grasp until we've seen all of them. And once we have, we can step back and start to understand what exactly that bigger picture is."
Now, he's referring to the games purportedly made by Coda that together comprise the Beginner's Guide. And as you complete Coda's games, you do come to find that there are repeating motifs and that each of these games do work together to form a bigger picture. But that got us wondering, If these separate games by Coda are actually intended to be taken together, could the same be true of the games Reedon is making? After all, since there is no Coda, it's clear that the idea for communicating a complete idea over multiple games is coming from Reedon. So, do the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide taken together share an overarching message? It certainly seems so. It's not that we ought to turn the games off and do something more valuable with our lives than press whatever buttons the game tells us to. It's that by critically engaging with the games we're playing, we can actually make that play itself a more valuable use of our time. At least that's our interpretation, and per his instructions, it's one we're going to share with Davey Reedon. But tell us what you think in the comments below, and share your own readings with Reedon by emailing him at daveyreedon@gmail.com and tell him Wisecrack sent you. Thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcast.